Legolas is stabbing with an arrow. Is it kind of easy or sensible? No, definitely not. These hobbits are extremely underarmed, and essentially in martial terms all you'd need is a couple of archers shooting arrows up there, and that would be 4 dead hobbits. Hi there, I'm Matt Easton of Scholar Gladiator. I teach people sword fighting and have done for 25 years, and today I'm going to be looking at some fight scenes with swords and other weapons from Lord of the Rings. One of the first things that always struck me as an aficionado and fan of medieval arms and armor was the fact that the armor's very developed. They're wearing quite a high level of development of armor, something that we'd really not see until about the 14th, 15th century in Europe. It always struck me as kind of quite advanced for how I imagine Tolkien's worlds. Just a minor thing, but you can instantly see that the armor is real, the weapons are made of steel, they've got a real good quality look to them. So something we see straight off the bat here is like an extremely long range shots with arrows and felling orcs and goblins with one shot. On one hand, obviously warbows were incredibly important throughout history and were very effective on the battlefield. They kind of overestimate, I think, the range of these arrows. For a start, they're shooting upwards as well in this particular shot. But most, even heavy warbows, even with really quite high draw weight bows, only have an effective range of about 300 yards most of the time. And yeah, okay, there are certain types of bows with certain very light flight arrows which can shoot much further than that. But an English longbow, for example, has an effective range of about 250, 300 yards. So I think they've kind of overestimated the range of the arrows here. And also, arrows aren't insta-kill. So just because an arrow hits a person, they're not just going to instantly fall down dead. But nevertheless, it's fun, and it shows us the importance of archery in warfare, which is very well represented in these movies, of course. And of course, bows have been hugely important throughout human history. So it's great that, like the civilized peoples, I'm not sure what to call them, I call them peoples, have a shield wall, and they are coordinated, and they look like they're regimented. The orcs and goblins are just a mass. They're just one big mass, heaving mass moving along. And that gives us an instant visual contrast, which I think actually works really effectively. So yeah, I think that looks really good. It sets the scene, and I think it's sort of accurate to how we're supposed to view these different groups of people. So these cutting upwards, the elven swords, this has been much commented on over the years. Now, what's interesting is in HEMA, that's historical European martial arts, that's what I teach, there is actually a characteristic of the montante. Now, the montante is a large two-handed sword, big two-handed sword, up to your face or even up to the top of your head in length. And these weapons were used, specialized by bodyguards, but also by people protecting the top of ships and protecting gateways. And what's interesting is these do often have rising cuts. The fact that Peter Jackson actually has the elves cutting with their big two-handed swords cutting upwards like this is actually kind of historically accurate to large two-handed swords. It's kind of a shame that they had this beautifully coordinated lined shield walls, and they were, very regimented and prepared, and then as soon as the battle starts, they all just break apart and it just turns into a great big heaving mass of melee. And I know that people say that, like even the best strategy doesn't survive first contact with the enemy and those kind of things, but nevertheless, people like the Romans or the Spartans or even Anglo-Saxon shield walls, they were trained specifically to keep together in formation. That was why they were successful. Even if we look at the Zulus, for example, they had to stick to the plan to some degree to have success. If you just break apart, well, what was the point standing in a shield wall to begin with? So I absolutely love the way that they show his super duper strength and obviously his very large size. And I think that equipping him with a large mace, that's what this is, it's a flanged mace. Again, it's based on 15th and 16th century examples, although scaled up and made much larger. I think it's the perfect weapon to give him, because if you were that big, if you were that strong, you're not going to be messing around stabbing people with a spear or, trying to slice them up with a sword. You're going to need a large bludgeoning instrument. Imagining you're fighting lots of people who are only relative to you that tall, you're going to be wanting to just sweep them away. So I really, really like the way this was represented. So just a brief comment on stamping on a sword to break it. Now, believe it or not, you might just think that this is something that only Sauron can do because he's a giant and super powerful. But in fact, humans can do it as well. And any of those antique swords on the wall behind me, I could break the blades of. It's not at all impossible to break the blade of a sword by stamping on it, or even across your knee. And we find examples of this in the actual combat treatises of the medieval and Renaissance periods, in techniques where you'll beat the opponent's blade down and stamp on it specifically to either bend or break it. So absolutely good stuff, and historically valid as well. Right, I have always had a problem with this chopping the fingers off. Okay, we've explicitly seen that Sauron wears amazing gauntlets. Okay, his hands are covered in steel or some other good metal. Okay, so he's got fully armored fingers, and all that Isildur has is the broken part of the sword, only about maybe 12 or 18 inches of blade, which is not a lot of blade to get much momentum into. It would be extremely difficult for a human, even a really, really strong human with a sharp sword, which is made of steel, to cut through something else which is made of an equivalent metal. Very improbable. If they had been thinking about what was going to have to happen in the story, him having his fingers chopped off, or maybe his hand chopped off, they shouldn't really have given him these amazing gauntlets, because chopping through gauntlets is just not really a plausible option. You can break fingers, but the fingers aren't going to come flying off. But overall, I've got to say, I mean, I'm obviously nitpicking because that's what I'm here to do, but I do absolutely love this opening scene. I love how efficient it is. It actually gives us tons of information about the story, but also about the arms and equipment, the different races or species. Loads of information packed into a really, really short summary, and it's very effective, very well done. And overall, the arms and armor looks fantastic. And Lord of the Rings is always held up as a very high benchmark for other fantasy series to try and aspire to. So one very brief thing I'll say about their armament is obviously they're armed with short swords. They are short in stature. That fits perfectly well. And they're very nicely designed and made short swords, very attractive and look completely valid as weapons. But generally speaking, people armed with short swords are better equipped also with shields. And essentially, in martial terms, these hobbits are extremely underarmed. They only have short swords. They don't have any armor, but they don't have any explicit armor. They don't have helmets, nothing to protect their heads. With shorter people, it's very easy to hit them on the head, and also they don't have shields, so they're utterly vulnerable to arrows, for example. All you'd need is a couple of archers shooting arrows up there, and that would be 4 dead hobbits. So they're very under-equipped, and we know under-trained as well. So a little glimpse of the gauntlets again there, and it's fantastic to see the gauntlets that have a historical precedent. They're clearly made of metal, they're beautifully designed, they look ergonomic, they are historically valid, they're based on historical examples, and absolutely they'd be workable armor. So we now know that these guys, as well as being undead, are equipped with longer swords and armor. So good luck, hobbits. Minor detail, but I just noticed that all of them bar one of the undead are right-handed. So with a long sword, your dominant hand is at the top of the grip. If you're left-handed, you put the left hand at the top of the grip. In this case, one of them seems to have their left hand at the top of the grip. If you're preparing to fight people, particularly with long swords, it's very important to note immediately whether they are left or right-handed, because it means that their predominance of attacks will come from different directions. The side that they can guard most easily will be the opposite. And so in modern Olympic fencing, for example, there's a high proportion of left-handers, because left-handers are used to fighting right-handers. Right-handers are not so used to fighting left-handers. So it's always important to note, is your enemy left or right-handed? So Aragorn jumps into the rescue, and he's swinging left and right. A couple of things to say about that. First of all, it doesn't look like he's making effective attacks, but actually that's kind of not what he's trying to do, is he? He's trying to clear them off, and in his other hand he's got a flaming brand, a flaming stick, and so we know that they're scared of fire to some extent, so, and presumably he knows that, and so swinging wildly left and right with the thing in each hand is actually a fairly good idea against multiple opponents. What you absolutely don't want to do is get into individually dueling one, while one of the others or three of the others come and hit you from behind or the side. So absolutely trying to occupy all of them with wild cuts. And again, if we look at the historical treatises, this is exactly what we see more or less advised. So if we go back to the Montante, the big two-handed sword, there's lots of drills for moving the sword around in big swinging arcs to keep multiple opponents at bay. It doesn't really matter whether you hit them or not. If you keep them away, then you'll achieve the goal. So what's interesting and really cool here is Aragorn does get into one-on-one dueling with one individual after the others are fleeing. So this is exactly right, completely martially valid. He's created space, he's set on fire at least a couple of them, which has caused, it looks like, 4 of them to start fleeing, and now there's one opponent left there, so he can now devote proper typical cuts and thrusts and normal dueling tactics against that one opponent to try and drive them back. So good stuff. Minor interesting detail that he uses his longsword, which is a hand and a half sword, so predominantly used two-handed, but he uses it one-handed because of course he's got a flaming stick in the other hand, and in that case his opponent also has, the Dark Rider also has his sword in one hand. Now you would think usually you have an advantage with the sword in two hands because you've got more points of leverage on it, and that's completely true. However, when you use a sword in one hand you have a longer reach, so in some cases you use a long sword in one hand when you want to strike from further away with it. Yeah, set them on fire. Brilliant tactic. So in this situation, the primary weapon here was the flaming stick. The sword was really just used to buy space and then fight that one individual when needed. But the flaming stick, as Aragorn clearly knew, the flaming stick was the key to success. This scene is absolute one of my biggest bugbears from this movie. So this is a fantastic movie, but this scene really bugged me. As someone who's trained people to fight with swords and been fighting with swords for more than 25 years, you just absolutely don't train with your sharp swords like this in a normal situation. Yeah, okay, there are a couple of fencing treatises from the 16th century that talk about using sharp swords to train. For the most part, if you're out in the wilderness and you have only got one sharp sword, what you absolutely don't want to do is risk breaking or damaging it in a training exercise. You go and get a stick. One element is protecting your sharp weapon. You don't want to run the risk of destroying the edges. You've got no easy way of repairing them out here. You don't want to damage your weapon. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's dangerous. These guys are complete noobs, okay? Boromir is teaching them the absolute rudiments of swordsmanship. What you shouldn't do, therefore, is do it with sharp swords. And Boromir is using his own sharp sword as well, chewing up the edges. Now, the reality is that these are blunt swords, and so that's probably why when they came to shoot this scene, they didn't think about that, because they're not sharp swords, they are not chewing up the edges, and if they do chew up the edges, well, they've got 10 other prop swords that they can grab from the cabin over there, so it's not a problem for them. But very, very silly from a safety point of view, and also from a sword preservation and edge sharpness point of view. So it bothers me on so many levels, and it would have been so much easier to just pick up some sticks lying around, and you could have done exactly the same degree of training with them. Oh, what did I say? Exactly. So if you play with sharp swords, someone's going to get cut. It was so inevitable. One thing I do love about this scene, though, to give it credit where credit's due, is that they finish up wrestling and rolling around on the ground and basically becoming friends. As I'm sure lots of people who've fought with siblings or friends as kids will know, this is, and anyone who does martial arts, you know, this type of roughhousing or playing is absolutely a good way of team building. And even today, we run sword fighting as team building exercises. So, I mean, you know, tactically, this is a horrible prospect. As an individual, you are literally just going to basically sacrifice yourself or try and hold off this horde, this attacking horde of Uruk-hai for as long as possible. What do you do? I mean, you can go on the attack, as Aragorn does. The other option would be to run, and as they get strung out, this is actually, again, in a medieval treatise, as they get strung out, you quickly turn around, take on one or two of them that have got close, then run again. So you kind of spread them out. But in this situation, I think he doesn't want to give them any opportunity to get closer to the rest of the Fellowship. So he is just going on the attack here, presumably expecting to die, because the odds are not good. So one small detail, you'll often see Aragorn going down at the knee level, kind of at the hamstring side of the leg. And this is actually a great target against opponents who've got some degree of upper body armor and shields. Particularly when you do any kind of shield fighting, you get a lot of leg hits because it's one of the only places actually that's exposed very often. So running up the stairs, fantastic plan. What he's doing is he's drawing them after him into a narrow space. It comes back to the point I made. If you've got more numerous opponents, you don't want to get surrounded. You don't want to get them around you. You want to either get your back to something or get into a narrow space where they're confined. There are a few situations in this larger choreography where you can see armor is being hit, like helmet, for example, rather than a gap in armor. And whether it's a thrust or a cut, one of the problems is that armor is specifically designed to prevent a cut or a thrust going through it. So I'm always a little bit bothered, for example, when someone gets donked on the helmet and then falls down dead. What did they die from? It wasn't concussion. Yeah, helmets do their job. So watch out for the armor being hit rather than the people. So just a brief word on Gimli's axe. So unlike a sword, an axe is a top-heavy weapon and hits with a lot more impetus than a sword does. So swords actually aren't great impact weapons at all. They function by the sharpness of their edges. Ergo, hitting people in armor with swords is not very effective. However, an axe, because it's top-heavy, like a hammer, if you hit someone really hard, it will have more of a percussive effect. It's more likely to knock them down. It's more likely to injure them through the armor. So when Gimli whacks armor, I'm kind of okay with it because not only is it an axe, it's a massive double-headed axe. So that is going to hit with the force of a sledgehammer, basically. Absolutely percussive force. The axe is a better weapon against armor than the sword is. Oh, Legolas is stabbing with an arrow. Could it be done? Yes. Is it kind of easy or sensible? No, definitely not. The problem is that arrows are really quite fragile. And typically, if you shoot an arrow into a tree, the shaft of the arrow will snap. It's really easy to snap an arrow. Even a heavy longbow arrow, which are very thick shafts and tapered, even those are relatively easy to snap. So trying to perfectly jam with no lateral twisting force an arrow into someone's eye hole in their helmet and hope that it doesn't snap, very unlikely. And because it's relatively flexible compared to a steel blade, it's not very easy to get a lot of penetrative force into it. Could it happen? Could it work? I suppose so, but as a tactic, probably not very well advised. So a really interesting detail here. So there's a big, heavy two-handed axe being swung, and Boromir comes in and grabs the shaft bit. And I really like this because a lot of choreographers would have had him interpose his sword one-handed because he uses a one-handed arming sword. Now, that would be quite a weak parry against a top-heavy two-handed swung axe. And in reality, with someone mid-swing, it would most likely collapse the parry of the one-handed sword. So his two basic options here are either to use the sword in a half sword, so take his second hand, grab the blade and put it like a bar and block the axe that way, or in this case to just drop his sword, as he seems to have done, and grab the axe two-handed and essentially wrestle the axe off the person. And he caught it mid-blow as well, so it's before it's reached its maximum velocity. I thought that was quite thoughtfully done and pretty accurate to what we would teach in martial arts. I absolutely love how this scene is done on the run. They are fighting, but it's so mobile, and I wish there were more skirmish melee battle scenes in movies that were like this. So many times when we see battle scenes or skirmish scenes like this, they're in one location, the cameras are obviously fixed or moving around on a track, and that's where they fight. But in reality, we know battles in history sometimes covered large areas. And for example, the Battle of Towton, which has been extensively archaeologically examined from the arrowheads in the ground and debris from the battle, we know that it stretched across about a mile of ground as one army retreated from the other. We also see the same with the Battle of Little Bighorn as well. We can see from the casings from the firearms that they're being shot by both sides. Battles and skirmishes were very mobile things, and I absolutely love the fluidity and the moving nature of this scene. It's fantastic. from a sort of weapons and martial perspective, I really like how the arrows were represented and how they weren't insta-kill. They weren't magic death rays. He took several arrows and was eventually incapacitated, but he continued fighting while being shot with arrows. Grim though it is, we know from historical accounts this absolutely happened. And the other thing to say is many people got shot by arrows, whether it was in the American West in the 19th century or in the Middle Ages in Europe. People got shot with arrows and survived. So it very much depends where they land, how much damage they do, and of course, how quickly you can get to medical attention. Now, Henry V, for example, famously of the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, when he was younger, he took an arrow to the face, and actually the royal surgeon removed it. And so he had a scar on his face, and the famous portrait of him is on the other side. You know, we know that people took arrows to their bodies and survived to live the tale. However, 3 arrows to the body probably lessens your chance of surviving, as here. The other thing we have to bear in mind as well, these arrows are penetrating, obviously not just him, but also the armor he's wearing. We can see that he's got mail, chainmail, and something else over the top of that as well. So it's penetrating several layers, but it looks realistic and it has a realistic effect on him. And I love the fact that he continues fighting while taking those arrows. So that creaking. So in the Lord of the Rings movies, creaking of bows is much like we know in Hollywood when someone draws a sword, we have to have the swing sound because it's Hollywood language for a sword or a knife has been drawn. Even when normally swords and knives don't make a swing when they come out of a scabbard, it just doesn't really happen very much. And equally in the Lord of the Rings films, when people are drawing bows, they always make this creaking noise. That's not something you really want your bow to do. If your bow's making a noise like that, there's something quite wrong with it, like it's about to break, basically. So there we go. It's a kind of filmmaker's language for a strong bow is being drawn, but it's not the noise that the bow should make. So a lot of things happened in a short space of time there, but I don't really have a problem with any of them. Perhaps the only one, well, the most dubious thing there is the throwing of the shield. So he picked up a shield incredibly quickly, then it was on his arm and he was using it, then he threw it, and Aragorn's head was trapped, or his neck was trapped by it, but then he managed to get his head out. I'm not entirely clear how all of that worked, but there we go. It looked fun, and I quite liked the way that Lurtz, I think his name is, the Uruk-hai, used his sword to try and basically take Aragorn's head off. But it's all good stuff, and then Aragorn quickly gets his dagger out and stabs it into the leg. This is a very important role for daggers in medieval period, or even fantasy medieval period type combat. The dagger is an absolutely essential backup weapon for people who are using swords and shields and spears and things like this. This is the perfect scenario to deploy it, essentially, because his sword's been knocked out of his hands. And of course, daggers super important if you're fighting in armor or against people in armor, because you often end up wrestling and end up very, very close, and that's the distance at which a dagger can make the difference between winning or losing. So I love the fact that Uruk-hai guy pulls the dagger out of his own leg and then throws it at Aragorn. And equally, I love the fact that Aragorn, by this point, has managed to scramble over to his sword, pick it up, and he bats it aside. Now, batting things aside, again, completely historically supported. We find it in martial arts treatises. We also find it written in descriptive texts. And in fact, even knocking aside arrows. And this is something which is still practiced to some degree today, probably most famously so in Japan, and usually as a kind of showing off display kind of thing. Now, if you're standing up, then you step aside. You step aside and then you chop the arrow or hit the arrow. So actually, what's protecting you from the arrow is stepping aside. In this situation, Aragorn's actually on his knees and the knife has been thrown at him. So he can't really step aside. So batting it aside with the sword, completely believable and valid, just the same as if someone throws a ball at you, you hit it with a bat. No different to that, really. So yeah, good stuff. this is again completely accurate. Aragorn has got a longer sword, a lighter, or should we say better balanced sword, and it's two-handed. And Aragorn is a very, very experienced swordsman, whereas Uruk-hai is not. He's a very strong and powerful fighter, but he's not got years of experience, and he's using a weapon that is shorter. It's a cleaver. It's not very well balanced. It doesn't have a good handguard or anything like this. So absolutely, someone with a long sword, basically anyone with a long sword who's practiced with it, should be able to overwhelm another person with a weapon like the Uruk-hai is using. And lopping the arm off, very, very nice, clean cut. However, we should have expected to see lots of blood squirting out at this point. Arterial sprays, I imagine, would have been going squirt, squirt, squirt out of that stump. Again, I love that finish. What a way to go. It's like, well, I'm going to die, but I'm going to scream in your face as I go down. I've never really understood how does he manage to pull the sword out, because Lurtz is pulling the sword into his body. So how does Aragorn manage to pull it back out and then do a moulinet, essentially circular cut, and take his head off? I don't really know. Biologically, I think we should have expected to see a bit more squirting of blood there, but they've decided not to do that. And in terms of cutting a head off with a sword, obviously you can do that. Executioners did that for centuries. However, it's a particularly difficult angle to do it from. Doing a horizontal cut on a person who's standing up in front of you is very much more difficult than someone laying their head on a block and doing a downwards cut. How do I know this? Because I cut things with sharp swords for practice for swordsmanship. So when we do test cutting, as we call it, you cut through straw or bamboo mats or other targets we might use. And basically, it's much more difficult to do a horizontal cut than it is to do a downwards cut. But nevertheless, Aragorn is Aragorn, so he can do it. It's a super sharp sword, and he's very practiced with it. So I thought it was a fantastic end to the fight.
Let us hunt some orc.
Fellowship of the Ring set a really high bar in terms of the arms and armor, the quality of it. The only thing I'd perhaps say is I think there's an overuse of long swords, of two-handed swords. People making movies aren't that keen on shields generally, because shields get in the way of nice shots and get in the way of people's faces and things like this. The choreography that you could do with a single sword in some ways looks more flashy on screen than the choreography with the sword and shield. Tolkien's original vision of the arms and armor of this period was probably set more in the kind of Anglo-Saxon Beowulf kind of Viking era. So I think probably they were supposed to be all wearing chainmail or less armor and a helmet if they had one, with a single-handed sword and a shield. However, they decided to go with a later kind of more advanced level of technology for these movies, which I'm fine with. I think it also helps differentiate. You can see what elves look like. You can see the difference between Gondor soldiers and Rohirrim soldiers, riders of Rohan. You can see, the orc armor looks completely different. So I think visually it actually helps you tell different groups of combatants from each other. With plate armor, it does introduce some problems, as I've mentioned, of how do you kill people in plate armor, because plate armor in the 15th and 16th centuries was incredibly good at protecting people from standard hand weapons and arrows. It kind of makes it difficult. If you want to hit someone and have them fall down dead, how do you do that on screen? And unfortunately, sometimes in this movie, we see some people wearing quite complete armor get hit and fall down dead, inexplicably. However, in the close-up battles, most of the time, we do see armor being bypassed in some way, being stabbed in a gap and things like this. I think overall, I love the choreography. It's exciting. It looks believable. You can buy into it. There are no bits of it for me which make me fall out of suspension of disbelief. The weapons and armor all look fantastic.
For more on Expert Reacts, make sure to watch a paleontologist reacting to Horizon Forbidden West, and make sure to let us know what other films or games you want Matt to react to.